The scream tore through the Utah dawn, like a blade through silk echoing off the red canyon walls with such raw agony that even the vultures scattered. Sarah Holt's hands trembled as she clutched her herb satchel, her breath catching in her throat. The homestead below lay in ruins, children's toys scattered like broken dreams, their bright colors now stained crimson. Bodies twisted in unnatural positions, limbs bent at impossible angles, faces frozen in terror. The metallic stench of blood mixed with something else, something chemical that made her stomach lurch. She pressed herself against the rough canyon wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that followed was worse than the scream, a silence so complete it felt alive, predatory. Her eyes darted across the carnage, searching for movement, for survivors, for answers. Nothing. Just death baking under the merciless sun. A shadow moved near the barn. Sarah's breath hitched. She squinted through the heat shimmer, watching as a figure emerged from behind the collapsed structure. Tall, lean, wearing a black duster that seemed to absorb the desert light. Even from this distance, she could see the patch covering his left eye, the cruel set of his mouth. Caleb Varn. The name whispered through frontier towns like a curse, always followed by tales of burned settlements and unmarked graves. More figures appeared, his gang, she realized, counting at least 6 men methodically searching the bodies. They moved with practiced efficiency, turning over corpses, rifling through pockets, their laughter carrying on the hot wind like the cackle of demons. Sarah knew she should run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee back up the canyon, to put as much distance as possible between herself and this nightmare. But her feet remained rooted to the stone, her eyes fixed on the horror below. She had seen death before: childbirth gone wrong, fever accidents, but nothing like this. Nothing so deliberate, so cruel. A hand fell on her shoulder. She spun, a scream dying in her throat, as she found herself face to face with her father. Thomas Holt stood swaying slightly, his clothes reeking of opium and cheap whiskey, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus. At 52, he looked ancient, his face a roadmap of poor choices and bitter disappointments. "Didn't expect to find you here, girl." He slurred, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze flicked toward the massacre below, then back to her face. "Though, I suppose you got nowhere else to go, do you? No husband wants a broken woman." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Sarah felt the familiar shame crawl up her spine, the weight of her supposed failure pressing down on her shoulders. At 26, she had endured 3 miscarriages and countless rejections. The frontier was unforgiving to women who couldn't bear children. They were seen as incomplete, cursed, worthless. "What are you doing here, Papa?" She managed, though part of her already knew. His presence, his lack of surprise at the carnage, the way he kept glancing nervously toward Varn's position. Thomas's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Business, Sarah. The kind that might finally make us some real money. Course, that was before you showed up where you don't belong." Below them, Varn had gathered his men around a wooden crate they'd pulled from the barn. Even at this distance, Sarah could see glass vials nestled in straw, their contents gleaming like liquid mercury in the sunlight. Varn lifted one, holding it up to the light, and his remaining eye glittered with satisfaction. "Mercury chloride," Thomas said, following her gaze. "Mixed with a few other things. Enough to poison every well in Cedar Falls. Town sits on a fortune in gold, but the folks there are too stubborn to sell. This'll change their minds real quick." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Cedar Falls, the town that had grudgingly allowed her to trade her herbal remedies for supplies, the only place that still tolerated her presence. Despite the whispers about her condition, 300 souls called it home, including children, families, people who had never done anything worse than look at her with pity. "You can't," she breathed. Those people. Thomas cut her off. "Never done nothing for us. Never done nothing for you." They whisper behind your back, call you damaged goods. Why should you care what happens to them? But she did care. Despite the cold shoulders and pitying glances, despite being relegated to the fringes of society, she cared. Because beneath the fear and prejudice, she had seen kindness too. Mrs. Patterson, who always paid fair prices for her pain remedies. Young Billy Chen, who helped her carry heavy supplies without being asked. Even Sheriff Caldwell, gruff and suspicious though he was, had never actually run her out of town. I have to warn them, she said, taking a step back from her father. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. You'll do no such thing. You'll keep your mouth shut and be grateful I don't tell Varn you're here. Man's got a particular hatred for meddling women. Sarah jerked free her herb satchel, swinging against her hip. And what makes you think he won't kill us both when this is over? Men like Varn don't leave witnesses. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in Thomas's eyes. Then his jaw hardened with familiar stubbornness. I'm useful to him. Been tracking this territory for months, learning the routines, the weaknesses. He needs me. He needs you until he doesn't. Sarah shot back. Then you'll end up like them. She gestured toward the homestead. Thomas's face flushed with anger, and something else, fear perhaps, or the desperate denial of a man who had bet everything on a losing hand. You always were ungrateful. Your mother was the same way, never satisfied, always questioning. Look where it got her. The mention of her mother hit like a physical blow. Elena Holt had died when Sarah was 12, supposedly in an accident during a trading expedition. But there had always been whispers, questions that Thomas refused to answer. The timing had been suspicious, right after Elena had started asking questions about missing supply shipments, about why certain traders never returned from the northern routes. What really happened to Mama? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas's face went white, then red. She fell from her horse. End of story. But the way he said it, the tremor in his voice, told Sarah everything she needed to know. Her mother hadn't died in an accident. She had died because she had asked too many questions, gotten too close to something dangerous. Just like Sarah was doing now. Below them, Varn was giving orders to his men. They loaded the poison crates onto pack horses, their movements quick and efficient. Sarah watched in growing horror as the reality of the situation crystallized. These men were professionals killers who had done this before. The Homestead Massacre wasn't random violence. It was a message, a demonstration of what happened to anyone who stood in their way. And now they were heading for Cedar Falls. I won't let you do this, Sarah said, backing away from her father. I won't let innocent people die. Thomas lunged for her, but the opium had made him slow, clumsy. Sarah twisted away, her years of navigating rough terrain giving her the advantage. She scrambled up the canyon wall, her fingers finding purchase on the sandstone ledges, her herb satchel bouncing against her back. Sarah. Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. You come back here, you'll ruin everything. She didn't look back. Couldn't look back. Because if she did, she might see the father she remembered from childhood, the man who had taught her to identify healing plants, who had held her when she cried after her first miscarriage. That man was gone, replaced by this hollow shell driven by addiction and desperation. Behind her, she heard Thomas shouting to Varn's men, his words carried on the wind. The girl, my daughter, she heard everything. Sarah's blood froze as the implications hit home. She was no longer just a witness, she was a target. Varn couldn't afford to let her reach Cedar Falls, couldn't risk her warning anyone about the poison. She had perhaps an hour's head start, maybe less. It would have to be enough. The trail down the canyon's far side was treacherous, a narrow path carved by flash floods and time. Sarah moved as quickly as she dared, her medical training warring with her desperation. A broken ankle out here would mean death, but so would moving too slowly. Behind her, she could hear horses' voices raised in discussion. They were organizing a pursuit. As she reached the canyon floor, the full scope of her situation became clear. She was alone in the Utah desert with minimal supplies, being hunted by professional killers, racing to warn a town that barely tolerated her existence. The smart move would be to head east toward the railway towns where she could disappear among the crowds. Let Cedar Falls fend for itself. But the image of children's toys soaked in blood flashed through her mind. The sound of that terrible scream echoed in her ears. She thought of little Mary Patterson, who always waved when Sarah passed by their house. Of old Doc Morrison, who had been kind to her despite his colleagues' disapproval of her primitive remedies. No, she couldn't run, not when 300 lives hung in the balance. Sarah adjusted her herb satchel and started across the desert floor, her shadow stretching long behind her in the morning sun. The heat was already building, promising a brutal day ahead. But she had water, she had her knowledge of desert plants, and she had something else, a burning determination to prove that her life had meaning, that she could make a difference despite what society thought of her. Miles ahead, Cedar Falls went about its morning routine, unaware that death was riding toward them across the wasteland. And somewhere between Sarah and the town, destiny was about to collide with a Cheyenne warrior whose own path of exile would soon intersect with hers. The desert stretched endless in all directions, broken only by the distant promise of mountains and the knowledge that time was running out. Sarah Holt, the woman society had written off as worthless, began to run. The wind had been Sarah's enemy for the past hour, whipping sand into her eyes and mouth until her throat felt raw as leather. She squinted through the stinging particles, following a game trail that wound between towering red rocks and thorny mesquite. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, but she didn't dare rest. Behind her, dust clouds marked her pursuers' progress. They were gaining ground. Her water was already running low. In her haste to flee the canyon, she'd grabbed only her medicine pouch and a half-empty canteen. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had spent years learning to survive in harsh conditions, was now racing toward death from thirst or bullets, whichever came first. A gunshot cracked across the desert, the bullet spanging off a rock near her head. Sarah dove behind a boulder, her heart hammering. They were closer than she'd thought. Through a gap in the stone, she could see 3 riders approaching fast, their horses kicking up rooster tails of dust. Varn himself led them, his black duster flapping like the wings of some carrion bird. She had to move. The boulder offered temporary cover, but once they flanked her position, she'd be trapped. Sarah clutched her herb satchel and broke from cover, running in a desperate zigzag pattern as more shots rang out. One bullet tugged at her skirt, another sent splinters flying from a dead tree inches from her face. Ahead, the trail split around a massive formation of red sandstone. Sarah chose the left fork without thinking, her lungs burning as she pushed herself beyond exhaustion. The path narrowed, winding between walls that rose 30 feet on either side. A perfect place for an ambush, but also perfect cover if she could stay ahead of her pursuers. She was so focused on the men behind her that she almost missed the figure sitting motionless on a ledge above the trail. When she finally looked up and saw him, her first instinct was to scream. He was massive, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin shirt. His black hair hung past his shoulders, braided with feathers and beads that caught the light. War paint streaked his bronze face in patterns she didn't recognize, and his dark eyes held a stillness that spoke of violence barely contained. Cheyenne. The word hit her like a physical blow. The wars between the tribes and settlers had been brutal, leaving scars on both sides that would never heal. She had heard the stories: entire families scalped, homesteads burned, children taken in raids. This warrior could kill her with his bare hands before her pursuers even caught up. But he made no move to attack. Instead, he studied her, with those fathomless dark eyes, taking in her torn dress, her desperate flight, and the sound of approaching horses. When he spoke, his English was precise, touched with only the faintest accent. "You run from the one-eyed man. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Behind her, the hoofbeats were getting closer. Varn's voice echoed off the canyon walls. She went this way. The tracks are fresh. The warrior Nodin, though she didn't know his name yet, tilted his head listening. His expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or an old anger stirring to life. Varn. He said the name falling from his lips like a curse. He killed my wife, my children. The words hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. She stared up at this man who had lost everything, seeing her own pain reflected in his face. Different circumstances, different tragedies, but the same fundamental wound: society's rejection of the weight of being deemed worthless or dangerous. I have to warn Cedar Falls. She gasped, finding her voice at last. He's going to poison their wells. 300 people will die. Nodin's eyes sharpened. Why do you care for people who cast you out? I have watched you in the trading posts, seen how they treat you. The question caught her off guard. Why did she care? The people of Cedar Falls had never embraced her, never made her feel welcome. They tolerated her medicinal skills when they were desperate enough, but always with suspicion, always with whispers about her unnatural childlessness. Because they don't deserve to die for other people's sins, she said finally. And because maybe this is the only way I can prove I'm worth something. Something flickered in Nodin's expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He dropped soundlessly from the ledge, landing beside her, with predatory grace. Up close, she could see the ritual scars on his arms, the careful beadwork on his shirt, the way his hand rested naturally on his knife hilt. The one-eyed man has 8 riders, he said quietly. They know this country. You will not reach Cedar Falls alone. Sarah's heart sank. She had known the odds were against her, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the situation feel hopeless. Then people will die because I wasn't strong enough to save them, perhaps, Nodin said. Or perhaps 2 outcasts might succeed where one would fail. Hope flared in Sarah's chest. You'll help me. Varn destroyed my family. Your people destroyed my tribe. But some debts transcend old grievances. He studied her face intently. You have medicine knowledge? I have war skills. We might survive long enough to matter. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Varn's voice carried clearly now. She's trapped in here somewhere. Spread out and flush her out. Nodin gestured toward a narrow crack in the canyon wall that Sarah hadn't noticed before. Can you climb? She nodded, though the crevice looked barely wide enough for her slim frame. Nodin boosted her up, his hands strong and sure, then followed with liquid grace. They squeezed through the opening just as the first rider rounded the bend below. The passage led upward through the rock, emerging onto a mesa that stretched for miles in every direction. From here, Sarah could see the full scope of the desert, endless expanses of red sand, broken by isolated mesas and distant mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay Cedar Falls, and time was slipping away like sand through her fingers. How long do we have? She asked as they began moving across the mesa's surface. Varn will want to strike at night. Nodin replied his long strides, forcing her to jog to keep up. Easier to approach the wells unseen. But first, he must gather the rest of his gang, position them around the town. We have perhaps 6 hours. 6 hours to cross 30 miles of brutal desert terrain. Sarah felt her determination waver, but then she remembered the children's toys soaked in blood and the sound of that terrible scream. She pushed herself faster, her herb satchel slapping against her hip with each step. They had been walking for an hour when Nodin suddenly stopped, his head tilted as if listening. Sarah strained her ears, but heard nothing except the wind. Then she saw them, 3 riders emerging from a ravine ahead, cutting off their route. They must have circled around, anticipating this escape route. Can we go back? Sarah whispered. Nodin shook his head grimly. More riders behind us now? They have us pinned. The trap was closing. Sarah's mind raced, cataloging the contents of her herb pouch. Willow bark for pain, sage for fever, dried prickly pear for wounds. And something else. A small packet of ground chili powder mixed with desert lavender, meant for treating severe congestion. In concentrated form, it would be almost like... I have an idea, she said, fumbling in her pouch. But I need to get close to them. Noden gave her a sharp look. What are you planning? Trust me. Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she trusted herself. The plan forming in her mind was desperate, probably suicidal, but it might buy them a chance. The riders were approaching at a steady pace, confident they had their prey cornered. Sarah recognized one of them, Jim Crassus, a man she'd seen in trading posts, who'd always looked at her with undisguised contempt. His companions were strangers, but their hands rested on their gun butts with practiced ease. Well, well, Crassus called out as they drew near. The barren witch and her savage friend. Varn's gonna be real pleased when we drag you back. Sarah stepped forward, her hands raised in apparent surrender. Please, I don't want any trouble. I was just trying to get to town for supplies. Crassus laughed harshly. Supplies, lady. The only thing you're gonna be supplying is entertainment when the boss gets hold of you. They were close now, close enough. Sarah stumbled as if overcome by fear and exhaustion and fell to her knees. As Crassus leaned down from his saddle to grab her, she threw a handful of the chili lavender mixture directly into his face. The effect was immediate and devastating. Crassus screamed, clawing at his eyes, as his horse reared in panic. The other riders, startled by the sudden chaos, fought to control their mounts. In that moment of confusion, Noden struck. Sarah had never seen anyone move so fast. The Cheyenne warrior seemed to blur across the ground, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. One rider went down with barely a sound, Noden's blade finding the gap between his ribs with surgical precision. The second man managed to draw his gun, but died with the weapon only half raised, Noden's tomahawk, splitting his skull like kindling. Crassus, still half blind from the burning powder, fired wildly in their direction. His bullet went wide, striking nothing but air. Noden's second knife took him in the throat, and he toppled from his saddle to lie gasping in the red sand. The whole fight had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Sarah stared in shock at the three bodies, her hands trembling with delayed reaction. She had seen death before, but never like this, never so swift, so efficient, so final. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder made her stomach lurch. Are you hurt? Noden asked, cleaning his blades on Crassus's shirt with methodical precision. Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice. The warrior studied her face with those disconcerting dark eyes, perhaps reading more than she was comfortable revealing. This troubles you, he observed. I'm a healer, Sarah managed. I save lives, not this. Today this was healing. Noden replied quietly. These men carried poison in their hearts. Now they cannot spread it. There was truth in his words, but it didn't make the sight of the corpses any easier to bear. Sarah forced herself to look away to focus on the practical necessities. They had horses now, and water and weapons. Their chances of reaching Cedar Falls had improved dramatically. But they had also made noise, created a disturbance that would draw attention. Even now she could see dust clouds in the distance, more riders converging on their position. We need to move, Noden said, echoing her thoughts. He was already catching the scattered horses, speaking to them in low, soothing tones. The animals trained for war responded to his calm authority. Sarah climbed onto the most docile-looking mount, grateful for the riding lessons her mother had insisted upon years ago. The horse was a sturdy bay mare, built for endurance rather than speed. Perfect for the long run ahead. As they rode away from the mesa, leaving the dead behind them, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed some invisible line. The woman who had awakened that morning was gone, replaced by someone harder, more desperate. someone capable of participating in violence, even if only as an accessory. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering in the heat like a fever dream. Behind them, their pursuers continued to close the distance, relentless as death itself. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Cedar Falls went about its daily business, unaware that its fate hung in the balance of a race between salvation and slaughter. Sarah Holt, the woman society had branded as worthless, rode toward her destiny with blood on her hands and fire in her heart. The sun climbed higher, promising a brutal day ahead. But for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The heat had become their enemy. By midday, the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the desert air thick and shimmering. Sarah's borrowed horse stumbled frequently, its breathing labored sweat darkening its flanks, despite their careful rationing of water. Beside her, Nodin rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. But even he showed signs of strain, the tight lines around his eyes, the way he constantly scanned the horizon for pursuit. They had been riding hard for 3 hours, following deer paths and dry creek beds to avoid open ground. Behind them, dust clouds marked the progress of at least 6 riders, probably more. Varn wasn't taking any chances this time. The horses won't last much longer in this heat. Sarah said, her voice cracked from thirst. Nodin nodded grimly. There is water ahead. A hidden spring my people use when hunting. But it lies in a box canyon, only one way in or out. A trap, perhaps, or sanctuary if we can reach it first. The canyon entrance was little more than a crack in the towering sandstone walls, easy to miss unless you knew where to look. They dismounted and led their horses through the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing off the stone. Inside, the canyon opened into a hidden oasis, green grass, cottonwood trees, and a spring that bubbled up from underground to form a small, clear pool. It was beautiful, almost magical in its contrast to the harsh desert outside. But Sarah felt no peace here. The walls rose 200 feet on all sides, creating a natural amphitheater with only one exit. If Varn's men found this place, they would be sitting ducks. Water the horses quickly, Nodin said, already scanning the rim above them. We cannot stay long. Sarah knelt by the spring, filling their canteens and drinking deeply of the sweet cold water. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, but the pleasure was overshadowed by growing dread. She could hear something now, the distant sound of horses drawing closer. They found our trail, she whispered. Nodin's expression was grim. 3 riders, maybe 4. The others must be circling to cut off our escape routes. What do we do? Before he could answer, a voice echoed off the canyon walls, cultured, educated, touched, with an accent Sarah couldn't place. I know you're in there, Miss Holt. There's no point in hiding. The voice didn't belong to any of Varn's usual men. This was someone new, someone who knew her name. Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications hit home. You might as well come out. The voice continued conversationally. I have something that belongs to you. Something you lost many years ago. Nodin had gone very still, his hand on his knife hilt. Who is that? Sarah shook her head, but recognition was dawning like a cold sunrise. The accent, the precise diction, the way he pronounced her name with just a hint of familiarity. Dr. Marcus Webb, she whispered. My former husband. The words hung in the air, like a death sentence. Nodin's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion she had seen him display since they met. The man who cast you out for your condition. Sarah knotted her throat tight with old pain and new terror. Marcus had been everything she thought she wanted, educated, sophisticated, successful. He had courted her with poetry and promises, married her in a ceremony that had been the talk of 3 counties. For 6 months she had lived in his elegant house in Carson City, playing the role of a doctor's wife, until the miscarriages started. 3 in 2 years, each one driving a deeper wedge between them. Marcus had grown cold, distant, finally cruel. He had divorced her publicly, citing her fundamental inadequacy as a woman as grounds. The scandal had driven her from civilized society, entirely forcing her to the margins where she scraped by, selling folk remedies to desperate people. Miss Holt. Marcus called again, closer now. I know this must be awkward, but circumstances have changed. I'm prepared to offer you redemption, a chance to reclaim your place in respectable society. Sarah's hands were shaking. What's he doing here? How did he find us? Noden's expression had turned dangerous. Men like that don't travel alone in country like this. He's with them. With Varn. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her ex-husband, refined, educated Dr. Marcus Webb, was part of Varn's gang. The poison plot, the massacre at the homestead, all of it had his fingerprints on it. The careful planning, the precise timing, the knowledge of which towns had gold and which had weaknesses. You see, my dear. Marcus continued, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I've learned so much since our unfortunate separation. About minerals, about chemistry, about the practical applications of various compounds. Varn has been most educational in that regard. Sarah felt sick. The man she had once loved, whose rejection had shaped years of self-doubt and isolation, was a mass murderer. How had she been so blind? But I'm willing to put the past behind us. Marcus went on. Join us, and you can have everything you've ever wanted. A real home, respect, security. All you have to do is walk away from this foolishness and let grown men handle business. And if I refuse? Sarah called back, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Marcus's tone shifted, becoming colder. Then I'm afraid you'll share the fate of everyone else who has stood in our way, including your current companion. A gunshot cracked across the canyon, the bullet striking the stone near Sarah's head. She dove for cover behind a boulder as more shots followed, ricocheting off the walls in a deadly hail of lead and stone fragments. Noden had already found cover behind a fallen log, his rifle ready. How many? He called. Sarah peered around her boulder, counting muzzle flashes. 4, maybe 5. They're on the rim. It was a perfect killing ground. The attackers had high ground and superior numbers, while Sarah and Noden were trapped at the bottom with nowhere to run. Their only advantages were cover, and the fact that shooting downward at steep angles was notoriously difficult. Sarah, Marcus called during a lull in the firing. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You know you can't win. But something had changed in Sarah during the long, desperate hours since she'd witnessed the massacre. The woman who had once believed herself worthless, who had accepted society's judgment of her as damaged goods, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. You're right, Marcus, she called back. I can't win, but I can damn sure make you pay for trying. She rummaged through her herb pouch, pulling out packets of various powders and dried plants. Noden watched with interest as she began mixing compounds with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years understanding chemical interactions. What are you making? He asked. Smoke, Sarah replied grimly. Lots of it. These cottonwoods are dry as tinder and the wind is blowing toward the canyon mouth. Understanding dawned in Noden's eyes. If they could create enough smoke, it would obscure the shooter's vision, maybe even drive them back from the rim. It was desperate, dangerous. The fire could easily trap them in the canyon. But it might buy them a chance. Sarah gathered dry grass and fallen branches, arranging them in strategic piles around the canyon floor. Noden provided covering fire as she worked his shots precise and economical. He wasn't trying to hit anyone, the angles were too difficult, but he was keeping the attackers honest, forcing them to stay behind cover. When everything was ready, Sarah struck a match and touched it to her improvised charges. The mixture of her herbal compounds with dry vegetation created thick, choking smoke that billowed upward like a volcanic eruption. Within minutes, The entire canyon was filled with a dense, acrid cloud that stung the eyes and burned the throat. The shooting from above became sporadic, then stopped entirely. Sarah could hear coughing, cursing, the sound of men retreating from the rim to escape the smoke. Now, Noden said. They mounted their horses and rode hard for the canyon entrance, navigating by feel through the choking haze. Sarah's eyes streamed tears, her lungs burned with each breath. But she stayed low in the saddle and trusted her horse to find the way. They burst from the canyon like phantoms emerging from hell, the desert sun blinding after the smoky darkness. Behind them, the fire had taken hold, in earnest, sending a pillar of black smoke into the crystalline sky. It would be visible for miles, a beacon that would draw every rider in the territory. But it had also bought them precious time. Sarah could see horses scattered across the desert floor, their riders nowhere in sight. Marcus and his companions were still trapped by the smoke and flames, unable to pursue immediately. Ride, Noden said unnecessarily. They were already pushing their horses to the limit, racing across the broken ground toward the distant mountains where Cedar Falls lay hidden in a valley beyond. Behind them, angry shouts echoed from the canyon as their pursuers finally escaped the smoke. It wouldn't take long for them to regroup to realize their quarry had escaped. The chase would resume within the hour, and this time there would be no mercy. But Sarah found herself smiling grimly as they rode. For the first time in her adult life, she had fought back against the forces that sought to diminish her. She had used her knowledge, her skills, her determination to strike a blow against those who would have written her off as worthless. Marcus's voice followed them across the desert, distorted by distance and fury. "You can't run forever, Sarah. I know where you're going. We'll be waiting." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this desperate flight would end in death and failure. But Sarah Holt was no longer the broken woman who had accepted society's judgment without question. She was someone new, someone dangerous, someone who refused to go quietly into the darkness. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Ahead lay the mountains, and beyond them, a town full of people who might live or die based on the choices she made in the next few hours. Sarah Holt rode toward her destiny with smoke on her clothes and fire in her heart, no longer running from her past, but racing toward a future she would write with her own hands. The mountains loomed ahead like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with the gold of late afternoon sun. Sarah's horse was beginning to falter, its breathing labored foam flecking its muzzle. Beside her, Noden rode with grim determination, but she could see the strain in his posture and the way he favored his left side, where a bullet had grazed him during their escape from the canyon. They had been climbing steadily for an hour, following a treacherous path that wound between towering pines and granite outcroppings. The air was thinner here, cooler, but Sarah found no comfort in the change. Behind them, dust clouds marked the progress of their pursuers, closer now, much closer. How much farther? She gasped, her throat raw from smoke and exhaustion. 2 miles to the pass, Noden replied. Then down into the valley, but they will catch us before we reach the town. Sarah's heart sank. They had come so far, overcome so much, only to fail within sight of their goal. She thought of the people of Cedar Falls going about their evening routines, unaware that death was racing toward them through the mountain passes. There, Noden said suddenly, pointing to a cluster of weathered buildings nestled against the mountainside. Old mining camp. Abandoned for years, but the structures still stand. Sarah studied the buildings with a practitioner's eye. Stone foundations, log walls, shake roofs darkened with age. The main structure appeared to be an old assay office, with smaller buildings scattered around it, bunkhouses, storage sheds, what might have been a saloon. It wasn't much, but it would provide cover, maybe a defensible position. "Can we hold them off there?"